Something that we haven't done in the previous video is to link our Paparazzi cards with our new Paparazzi pages, which means at the moment if I click on a card, nothing happens. So let's fix that. We'll go to our Paparazzi card component and we'll add a click listener that calls router push, and the route that we're looking for is the overview page. So name will be Paparazzi show overview, and we have to give it the ID of the paparazzi that we want to visit. So params ID equals paparazzi.id. Okay, so now if I save this, I can go back to my application, click on a card, and we're visiting the relevant paparazzi page. Okay, now we'll use this episode to design the content of that overview section. So for that section, we'll display two panels. One which displays the name of the paparazzi and an overview of its data. So for example, the URL that is being used to take screenshots, or the time the next screenshot is scheduled for. We'll also have a button in that panel that will help the user create new shots manually. And finally, on the second panel, we will display the latest shot that has been taken by the paparazzi. Because we'll be taking screenshots of potentially full pages, we'll make sure that this image is scrollable. And right next to it, if we have space on larger screens, we'll display some of its metadata. And if you remember, that data will simply be a capture of the data of that paparazzi when the screenshot was taken. Okay, so let's implement that. We'll go to our paparazzi show overview component and update our first panel. So we'll give that panel a title, which will be equals to the name of the paparazzi. And for the subtitle, we'll simply be displaying the amount of shots that the paparazzi has. So that's sub paparazzi.shotCount shots. And because it is possible for a paparazzi to have only one shot, let's make sure we remove the S for that case. Okay, so now if I save this, we can see a title and a subtitle for our overview section. And if you remember, our best panel has a named slot called actions for that purpose. So we'll create a new template for the actions named slot. And inside we'll create a new base button called shoot now. Okay, now let's move on to our metadata. We'll simply display that metadata as a list of icon and text. So before we start designing it, let's prepare the data that we're going to display. We're going to create a new computed property called metadata. And this is going to return an array of objects where each object has an icon and a value. And we'll be displaying 5 of those objects. Okay, so for the first piece of data, we will display the frequency for human, which is available at this.paparazzi.frequency for humans. And we'll use the icon called time. For the second piece of data, we will be displaying the next time a shot will be created automatically. So we'll write next shot in, and then that data is available at this.paparazzi.next shot in. And for that one, we will use an icon called arrow thin right circle. Okay, next we'll be displaying the dimensions of the device we are emulating when we're taking the screenshots. So that is this.paparazzi.device for humans. And that will use the application icon. Next, we'll display the URL that the paparazzi is using to take the screenshot. So that's this.paparazzi.url, and we'll use the link icon. And for our last piece of data, we will be displaying any CSS that is to be injected to the page before taking the screenshots. So that's this.paparazzi.css, and we'll be using the paint icon for that one. And since that last piece of data will be displaying CSS, so basically code, I would like it to be displayed using a monospace font. So I'm going to define a third property on that object called design. And this is going to be equal to font mono, which is a class provided by Tailwind CSS to make sure that your text is using a monospaced font. So now we have to make sure that when we display those items, we make room for a design property that is going to add more classes to that text. Okay, and finally, it is possible that some of those values are actually empty. For example, the CSS attribute is completely optional, so we don't really want to be displaying an icon with no text next to it. So we're going to add a filter to that array that is going to make sure we only keep objects that have some value to display. And we do that by adding .filter. For any object X, make sure that it has a value to display. Okay, so now let's display that array of metadata. We will display this as a table, and we'll make sure that this table takes all of the width available and that the text within that table is small. Next, we will display a row for each piece of data. So that's v4 item in metadata. And because our items don't have many attributes, we'll destructure them. So icon, value, and design. And because all the icons will be different, we'll be using the icon attribute as a key. Now for each row, we'll have two cells, the first one for the icon and the second one for the text. So let's start with the icon. We'll give it a fixed width of 5 and a fill current as usual. And we'll make sure that its primary part is lighter than the rest, so text gray 500. And we'll create a second cell for the text. For the cell that contains the icon, we'll give it a width of 1 pixel to make sure that the icon only takes the amount of space required to display itself, but nothing else. We'll then add a padding right of 2 and a vertical padding of 2 as well. Okay, and the last thing to do is to use that design attribute to add more classes to our text. So here, class equals design. And you can see that our CSS is now using a monospaced font. Now for the next panel, we're going to display a similar thing for the data of the screenshots. So before we move on to the next panel, I think it's time for us to refactor this table into its own component. And because that component is going to be a simple reusable piece of design, we're going to make it a base component. So let's copy this and go to our components directory, and we'll create a new base metadata.view component. And we'll paste the code that we had before. So now for this to work, all we have to do is add the metadata as a props. Now we can come back to our Paparazzi show overview component and replace this with base metadata. Metadata equals metadata. Okay, now if I save this, it doesn't work because we need to restart hot reloading. And now it works. Okay, so let's move on to our next panel. We'll add a new panel underneath our first one. And for this to work, we need to wrap both of these in a single element. So we'll create a new div and move both of them inside that div. And let's give a margin bottom of 8 to separate them a bit better. Okay, so let's add a title to that panel. We'll call it latest shot. And as a subtitle, we will display the relative time of when that shot was created. So that is simply paparazzi.latestShot.created ago. And because it is possible for Paparazzi to have no shots yet, it is possible that it won't have a latest shot. So we will only display that panel if it does. So vf paparazzi.latestShot. Now, just like we did in our previous panel, we will add a button next to the title. So template for the actions named slot, and we'll add a button for the user to see all of the shots available within that paparazzi. So base button, view all shots. And we can actually make that button work already because it's simply going to be a shortcut to that shots subpage. So we'll add a click listener, router push, and the route is named Paparazzi show shots, and it has as parameters an ID which is equal to paparazzi.id. Okay, so now if I save this and I click on view all shots, it automatically redirects me to the shots subpage. Okay, so now we're ready to display the latest shot in that panel. And because that design could be used in the future, let's say to create a full page gallery, we will extract that into its own component. And we will call that component shot frame. It will take two props, one which is the paparazzi, and another one which is the shot to display. Now this is not a base component, so let's register it. We'll import shot frame from shot frame and add it as a component. Next, we'll go to our components directory and create that shot frame.view component. Now let's start by adding those two props here. So props paparazzi, which is an object, and shot, which is also an object. Now let's design this shot frame. If you remember, we'll have the image on the left and the metadata on the right, but only when the screen is big enough. So that means we need to have a flex container that will align all of that for us. So we'll create a new div that has the flex class and the item center class. Inside that flex container, we'll have two elements. The first one, which will be for the image, and the second one, which will be for the metadata. Okay, let's start with the image. We'll add an image tag where the source is shot.image. Okay, so first let's give the container of this image a flex1, but limits its maximum width by using max W3XL. And we'll also limit its maximum height so that we can scroll within some kind of frame. So even though it doesn't exist by default in Tailwind CSS, we'll be using max HMD. So now for this to work, we need to adjust our Tailwind CSS config file. So let's go to our tailwind.config.js file, and up here, we will extend the max height property and add the medium size, which will make equal to 28 rem. Okay, so now if I save this, you can see that our image has been cut to that size. Okay, let's go back to our shot frame component, and we'll add overflow y auto to make sure that we can scroll within that frame. Now let's improve the design of that frame a little bit. We'll give it rounded corners, a shadow, and a border. Let's make that border a gray 400, and we'll increase that to 500 when we hover on top of it. So border gray 500. Okay, so that's good enough for me for the frame. Now let's move on to the metadata. Here we'll add our base metadata component. And for the metadata variable, we will basically copy paste what we had in our Paparazzi show overview component. So all of this. Except that we will remove the information about the next shot. And this.paparazzi needs to become this.shot. Okay, so let's give some padding left to that container and limit its maximum width by providing max W small. Now let's add a little header on top of that metadata. We'll add a title, which will display the name of the shot, so shot.name. And below this title, we will display the absolute date that the shot was created at. So div And that's available at shot.createdAt. Now we'll make that title a little bit bolder. And for the text, we'll give it text SM and font medium. And let's make it lighter. And because the header is a little bit too close to the metadata, let's give it a margin bottom of 4. Okay, so now the only thing to do is to make sure that we hide all of that metadata when we don't have enough space. And at the moment, we really don't have enough space because we can't really see the latest shot. So let's make that container hidden by default. And we'll display it when we reach the large breakpoint. Okay, so at this size, we can only see the image, but if I increase the size of the screen, now we can see our metadata. And if we go back to our shot frame component, you can see that we actually don't use that paparazzi props. So let's remove it. And let's also remove it from the parent component. So paparazzi show overview here. Okay, so that's everything for the overview section. In the next episode, we will have a look at the shot section.